T, it's a TH. Catamathia. So anyway, right, so the, let's start in fact. So keep your finger at Mark 6. I'm going to tell you the reason, what's interesting about the same story appears in all of the synoptic gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Of these, surprisingly, Luke is the shortest. And I thought about it, I've been thinking about it for a long time and trying to figure out why that would be. Luke is usually longer. He tends to develop things to a greater extent, certainly than Mark and sometimes than Matthew. And I finally came up with a reason. And that is because this particular story was very much involved with Jewish politics that Mark, and particularly Matthew's readers, would have known well. But Luke, who was writing for Gentiles, they would have no knowledge of this and couldn't care less. So that's why I think Luke just sort of mentions it in a couple of lines and then heads off. But Matthew is one of the problems with Matthew in trying to understand this story is that he assumes knowledge that his readers would have had, but we don't. Mm-hmm. When he mentions Herod, for example, he doesn't have to explain which Herod he's talking about because everybody would have known. Mm-hmm. For us, there are a bunch of Herods, and it isn't, and if you just read the Bible, I mean, many people to this day get confused between Herod at the beginning of Matthew in chapter 2, Herod the Great, and this Herod with John the Baptist, who is Herod Antipas, who was his son. So they would read this, and back in chapter 2, and then of course when it is mentioned that when the angel comes to Joseph in Egypt and says, "Oh wow, the people who wanted to kill your son are dead," referring to Herod, they go, "Well, doesn't he appear later? Why is he?" And so that's so it is an assumption that everybody, one of his readers would have understood that Herod in chapter 2 died in essentially 4 BC, and this particular Herod was flourishing 30 years later. And so this one is Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great. And Herod I've explained a little bit before about Herod the Great, but Herod the Great was he ruled a long time, and he was very successful in allowing himself to be, allowing the kingdom to be considered by the Romans to be, sort of a subservient kingdom, but not a Roman province. And because they politically, it would have been very dicey for him to have cut a deal with the Jews, with the Romans. It would have been politically dicey with his Jewish supporters. To have become a Roman province, they didn't want to be. They're all still looking at the great Davidic kingdom, and they're hoping for the restoration of that kingdom one way or another. And so, and since Herod himself was not really Jewish, and I'm sure they reminded him of that every chance they have, he is very careful to have, at least on paper, that he was king of a kingdom and not the governor of a Roman province. This becomes important later because as we later find out, parts of that area then become a Roman province with a Roman governor. So after Herod died, he went to Rome and said, "I'll take over for my father. I got the experience, been around a while, but the Romans were no fools, and they knew that there were other contenders, and in fact, some of his brothers came to Rome and made the same plea. So the Romans decided they were just simply going to divide the area up into various tetrarchs was what they were called, and that so they were rulers of a fourth of Herod's old kingdom. But what they were not called were kings. And so this is one of the reasons why it's interesting what Matthew says and what Mark says. Everybody who heard Matthew or listened to and read Matthew knew that Herod Antipas wanted to be a king and was not allowed to be a king. And so Matthew specifically refers to him in the story as a tetrarch, which probably caused some amusement among his readers because they understood the background, which we do not. So so there was a certain irony there that Matthew was deliberately using. The first couple of lines in this, the first couple of verses, it says, sorry, 14. Okay, it said, at a certain time, Herod the Tetrarch, which, by the way, not all translations pick up on, which I find a pity because it misses Matthew's irony, heard the news of Jesus, and he said to his, now it's translated in most places as servants, but the literal translation is boys. That could mean anything from a slave to an actual paid servant. Again, it's the ambiguity of the Greek. And he says, and it goes on, this is John the Baptist. He himself, interesting, Greek very rarely uses a personal pronoun. So Matthew has made a point of putting one in there. He himself has risen from the dead, and through this, the powers grow in him. Now this is, this takes place at the beginning of Jesus's mission. Everything else then is sort of a flashback. So, what Herod is thinking about is that there was a superstition in a number of, and remains in a number of cultures, that that sometimes when people die, their ghosts come back, particularly if they were cultural icons or had a great effect on the civilization, come back and people would report sightings of them, right? As my commentary says, it says like Banquo in Macbeth or Elvis, and it is. And so he was, and sometimes these ghosts came and haunted somebody who had done something to them. Again, look at Macbeth. And this was kind of it was not as though it was a developed theology. Nobody said that. It was a practice that people rose from the dead, and it was just kind of a superstition. But it worried him. He's always fighting with his brothers. Herod is. He knows he probably did a bunch of things wrong, and he's wondering whether or not this, like Scrooge, these ghosts have come to haunt him and tell him of his past misdeeds. So in order to kind of understand all that's going on here, fortunately we have not only the Bible to look at, but there is an author named Flavius Josephus. Mm-hmm. Josephus wrote 2 works, The Wars of the Jews and the Antiquities of the Jews, that were written because Josephus was attached to the Emperor Vespasian's court before he became emperor. When he was the general who was essentially in charge of laying waste to Jerusalem in 70 AD, Josephus was captured and got himself attached to the court because he predicted that Vespasian would become emperor. And turned out that Vespasian did become emperor, and by many accounts was not one of the worst. He certainly. This was right after. AD 69 is the year of the 4 emperors. That single year, and so it was very unsettled. Nero had committed suicide. And there was a lot of people who were running around trying to take the throne. And Vespasian was actually nowhere near Rome at the time. He just sat there and waited for everybody else to tire themselves out, and he moved in along with Josephus. And Josephus said, in order to deal with these people here in the Near East, you've got to understand them. You've got to understand their background. You have to understand their history, where they come from, how they think, how they worship. And Vespasian said, well, why don't you write something on it? So Josephus, being a historian, did that. And he has a lot of detail about this story, in fact, along with other things that add a certain amount of detail to our understanding. But what it also does is it adds corroborating evidence. If Josephus says that Herod Antipas killed John the Baptist and mentions where it took place, it's a pretty good bet that that thing actually happened, that event actually happened. Mm-hmm. And that, rather than just have the single testimony of the Bible. So he said, Josephus says in particular that in his Antiquities of the Jews, he said that the execution of John took place in Perea, which was one of the provinces that Herod Antipas was in charge of, and one of his palaces, which would be consistent with what we know from the story, because when they went to get John, of course, he's really nearby. So the prison was either part of the palace, attached to it, or very very nearby, that the word could get, bring the head of John the Baptist, whatever. So Herod had two palaces, one at Machaerus and the other in Tiberias. The background is, and it's hard to get this straight, because it is so complicated, but Herod was married to somebody whose name I don't recall off the top of my head. He divorced her in order to marry Herodias, who, by the way, was his niece, but never mind. And she was married to his brother, who was known as Philip. So she left Philip, not bothering to divorce him, and married Herod. She, by the way, was also Philip's niece, as well as, which would make sense. If she was Herod's niece, she would have been Philip's niece. And so the justification I thought that was all interesting. Herodias probably used the Roman law to divorce Philip, because women couldn't divorce men under Jewish law, but they could under Roman law. But certainly people like conservative Jews like John the Baptist, they didn't consider that to be a real divorce. And so under the Mosaic law, you could marry your brother's wife, but not when he was still alive. So because it was common. If you remember, Jesus tells a story at one point. Maybe the Sadducees who come to him and say, let's put this conundrum to you. There was a man, and he had a wife, and he died, and his brother married her according to the law. Then the brother died, and so his brother married her according to the law. This went on 7 times. When the resurrection comes, they say, whose husband who will be our husband after the resurrection?
The first one.
Well, the thing was, and the point that's made in the gospel, of course, is the Sadducees didn't believe the resurrection.
Oh, okay.
So they were trying to put it to Jesus. They tried to give him an impossible question, and Jesus said, "People aren't married in heaven. Doesn't matter." So it's it's
Disappointing.
and so the question is irrelevant, and they went away disappointed, I think, is what the line says.
So is Herodias Jewish?
Yes, she is.
Yes, okay. That is
And
confusing for me, about these leaders.
yes, but that is exactly the point. It would not have been confusing to Matthew's readers because they knew all these guys, right?
Well, there's no procreation in heaven. That's why the fallen angels came down, saw that human ladies were very fair, and procreated with them.
Okay, that is true. That's that certainly is a That certainly is one of the stories, yes.
So in other words, in heaven, they're saying that we're all just sort of independent of everybody?
I'm sure there were attachments. And if you, if you think about it, and this is getting into interesting theology, if the brothers married, presumably she picks the first, marries the first husband, because she wants to.
Mm-hmm.
When he dies, the only way that she can survive is by being married.
Right.
And so the rest of them marry her according to the law, because they have an obligation. It's not necessarily because they're
interested.
have the hots for her, right?
Yeah.
So they're doing a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you could say that probably it was, as you pointed out, the first husband, because that was the one for whom it was her choice. That would be an interesting feminist approach, if you want to think about it. So anyway,
Getting off subject.
right, so that's okay. I mean, that's what this is for, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, John didn't, had huge problems with this. And he told Herod's son, and he told everybody who would listen. And Herod got tired of this, and so he threw him in prison. He apparently didn't try him. There were ways to. There was a court system, and Herod didn't bother. Felt he didn't have to. And but he would call John up. And as Mark says, he used to enjoy sitting and listening to him. Matthew doesn't put it quite that way. He just, but both of them say, and it's an interesting Greek construction,